having a clearly defined target is the mechanism through which you can get feedback. So not having a clearly defined target means that you're not able to get feedback on how you should be growing.
Yes, and here's the big danger of not setting goals. Because if you're not setting goals, you may be missing out on the ability to understand what you actually want. The key indicator of success for a business person or an entrepreneur, and I would say for anyone in life, is speed of execution, decisiveness and speed of execution. Not doing the right thing, but doing something. Hello, Architect Nation, and welcome back. This is the right place for you if you run an architecture practice. And on today's episode, you'll discover the hidden reason that many architects struggle to hit their business goals and what you can do instead. How to turn vague dreams into measurable, motivating targets that actually get accomplished, and why the hustle harder mindset might be secretly killing your creative energy, and how to fix it fast. And now, a word from today's sponsor.
Today's episode is sponsored by Gelt. Is your architecture firm just filing taxes or actually using them to grow the business? Gelt is your partner in optimizing your taxes so you can focus on scale. They work with you year-round, not just at tax time, taking a proactive approach that combines expert CPAs and powerful technology, from smart entity structures to overlook deductions and smarter compensation planning. Gelt helps architecture firms unlock strategies most accountants miss. And exclusively for Business of Architecture listeners, Gelt is offering 10% off your first year. Don't wait for next tax season. Schedule your complimentary consultation at joingelt.com. That's JOINGELT.com to learn more and mention BOA when you sign up.
Hello, Architect Nation. Welcome back. I'm sitting here with my co-host, Ryan Willard, and today we're going to be talking about strategies for goal setting and achieving massive goals in your architectural practice. So, Ryan, when we talk about goal setting, I don't know. This is a topic. How many architects do you think in their practices actually set goals?
So my anecdotal experience would be not a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I think architects are very good with setting goals when it comes to perhaps the vision of individual projects, or perhaps with the vision around the kind of architecture that they would like to be doing. But I'd also make a distinction between a goal and a desire, or a goal and a kind of just a want. So often people can articulate quite clearly the sorts of things that they would like to be doing, but there isn't necessarily a structure, a plan, or anything that's more objectively measurable about the accomplishment. So it remains quite nebulous and what I'll call in the world of, a dream. As opposed to like a clearly pinpointed goal.
That's good. I know I do that all the time myself.
It's part of the process. It's definitely part of the process. And it's an important piece is to allow yourself to dream. And that's more disappointing when we come across people who aren't even doing that. And the only image of the future is one of just getting out of the pain that exists right now. And that's kind of, unfortunately quite common. Or the vision of just being able to survive. So we often call that scarcity.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the goals that we see firm owners making. Typically, when we're talking firm owners, small firms, less than 30 people, what are some of the goals that you see the firms that we work with making?
So the practices that we work with, we put them through a goal setting process, and we'll be asking them to be very clear with the kind of goals that they want, and we'll always start with a scale, like goals for what the business could and should look like. We'll start with benchmarks around performance, and we talk about the 200 Club a lot at Business of Architecture. And what does a business of 30 people look like where you're operating at $200,000 per full-time equivalent employee? So that starts to give a good benchmark of a high-performing business at that scale. And usually that creates a bit of a gap because, not every business comes in working with us. They're already at the 200 marker. So, okay, great. Now we've got a business of 30 people all bringing in $200,000 or above dollars per person. That starts to give me a $6 million kind of revenue target. Okay, great. Now we're starting to get some shape to what the goal might look like. Then the next part of that goal would be a time frame. How long do we want that to take? And again, to begin with, sometimes it is a bit, you're choosing numbers that have got evidence behind them of what is a good performing business, and then setting a time frame to it. But as soon as we do that, it gives us feedback. And I think that's what's really important, because for us, we're really interested in planning as a discipline and something that it's important for us always to be doing, so that we're getting that feedback. Because if we don't have a clearly defined goal that's something objectively measurable, i.e. dollars, and with a time frame, the quality of the feedback diminishes. Hence why with a dream of a sort of outline of what it is that I want, it's useful because it starts to get us thinking, but it doesn't have the capacity to give us the feedback that the discipline of planning really demands or is most effective.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love that. So the idea of feedback is so important because oftentimes it's difficult for us to see where we're actually at and if what we're doing is actually working.
Yes.
And the way that we understand that is through feedback. For instance, I've set goals and I've gone through the entire year without really making any measurable progress on those goals. You see that goal there and you're like, well, I didn't get any close to that one, It's marking that off again and again and again. And that's really useful feedback, because then that allows me to tell that, I probably don't care about this goal that much. It's probably not that important to me. Why am I not moving this down the field? And it's hard to understand that about myself if I'm not actually setting those goals, measuring it not only every single week, but every single month. And then if months are going by and I'm making no measurable progress on that goal, then I can infer that I really don't care about it that much. And this is one of the challenging things in life and business when it comes to desires, goals, dreams, is we can say we want something, and yet the question is, do we really want it?
Yeah.
And in my experience, most of us don't really know what we want. And this is something that even I struggle with. So we were down here, we're in Manhattan, and we were down at this beautiful bookshop yesterday, and I picked up that orange notebook, right? And the reason why I picked that up is because I want to get in the habit of starting to write down the things that I want every single morning, just writing them down to lock them in so I can sort of triangulate. You remember, and I remember back in school, we used to use the guess and check method.
Right.
When we were learning how to do different mathematical equations, instead of them just giving us the equation, we'd have to guess. We'd guess a number, we close, and we'd guess and check. And a lot of times it feels like that's what it feels like to try to figure out what I really want, which is a crazy thought because, it's easy for me to say, well, I'd like to spend 6 months in Costa Rica surfing at the beach, but do I really want that? Am I willing to do what it takes to get there? What are the things in my life do I want to have? And typically when we sit down with firm owners who come into our intake process who are interested in implementing smart practice in their practices, oftentimes they don't know what they want. And so it's not uncommon. It's not uncommon, number one, to not know what we want. And as you mentioned, number two, oftentimes at that early stage when we're just starting to set goals, we're starting to think about these things like business and what's possible for us. Oftentimes the goal is simply to get out of the pain that we're in, simply to get out of the stress, simply to get out of the overwhelm. If only I had less stress. If only I had less overwhelm. And then one thing that can be challenging with that kind of goal is we can actually be addicted to stress and overwhelm and not even realize it.
Yeah, it's like a handbrake.
Yeah,
That's
which is
on
crazy.
In terms of the vision and things that you actually say that you want to have. But your identity has become wrapped up in being so busy. And that's also kind of, that goes to a deeper level when we start to see as how people's identity has become wrapped up in their busyness, that it becomes very difficult to let go of those destructive behaviors that are obscuring them to the goals and the visions that they want. And one thing that's quite interesting is yesterday I was having a conversation with one of our clients, and they had a bit of anxiety around performance review that they had. And they're quite good. They're very disciplined. they have a performance review with their team members maybe once a month. We often recommend at least every quarter, and it's a good culture to have. And the way that the situation was occurring for them was a kind of like heavy, oh, I don't
I'm
want
going to be judged.
and that they didn't want to have the performance review with the team member because it felt like we have to tell them off, and when we're disappointed. And so there was a kind of something missing in that process, where even just the word performance review just sort of strikes a sort of heavy energy of it being something analytical and disciplinary that they didn't want to have to engage with. So we looked at that, and the idea of visioning kind of arose, of like, really, what is this conversation about? It's about supporting a team member with them working towards a vision and a goal that they want to have happen in their life. And they were saying, well, one of the things that's difficult is that, number one, when we start asking our team, what do you want? They don't know. They've never really been asked that question before in some cases. And sometimes they don't feel safe to tell you what they really want. And so what they say that they want is what they think you want them to want. So we get into this kind of interesting scenario where a team member is now saying what they think you want them to say that they want. So it kind of looks good, and we're in this nice professional tick box exercise where everyone is behaving well. But then that lowers the meaning of this conversation. That is really a creation conversation, a conversation about what's the future that we want to create? What do you really want? What's most important to you in your life? And that's a really enriching and powerful conversation to have, as opposed to a checklist against where you did or didn't do something that you were going to do against a goal that was fictitious in the first place because it was what you thought I wanted to hear.
Yeah, no, that's really profound. The other thing that comes up there is, as you're talking about this idea of performance reviews and knowing what we want, the part that I find that we typically miss on this is, and I'm speaking we as the general, we people in general, is that we don't really correctly identify where we're at to start with. And that's so intensely important, because if a team member, if we're going to figure out what a team member wants, the way that one is generated, it comes out of the current situation of where I'm currently at.
Yeah, exactly. And that takes a little bit of courage as well, to be able to look at the things that aren't working. And so we have a process at Business of Architecture, Pit to Peak, which we run all new clients through at the very beginning. And it's really a 3-month intensive where we look at all the things that aren't working or not working as well as you'd like them to inside of your business. And in that process, and particularly when it's done with a ruthless honesty, and you are taking stock and audit of all of the pains, problems, your own emotional world, your frustrations. Okay, great. We can start to dig into them. It starts to create a bit of leverage for you as well. And it starts to create a sense that continuing on with these problems is unacceptable. Sometimes we'll use a concept called the default future, which is the idea that the default future is an already existing predetermined future that is based on your current results. And when people start thinking about that and they project out what I'm doing right now and what that means for the future, and you see a future that's either exactly the same as where you are now or worse, then it becomes unacceptable. Now there's a bit of energy involved in it. Now there's some motivation to start defining, well, what do I want? And so it's a really good leverage mechanism to start asking that question and defining what it is I want. This question of what do I want, I think is, again, it's so important. And rather to get caught up in the thing that I want, that rather it's a question to prompt a new way of looking and kind of getting aligned with your own core values, the things that are most important to you. What is purpose in your own life? What does vision mean for you? How can you be fulfilled ultimately? And we can start to paint a broad picture of all these different areas of life, of where you want to go, and an image of yourself. And what's interesting as well is that, there's clues already that exist to the things that we want to have happen or what our vision is. Often people have got hobbies or little interests, and we often encourage our clients to dig in with their own team members. What's happening in your team members' lives? What kind of goals, what interests do they have? Because these will start to paint a picture of other talents or places and desires that they want to expand upon. Family is always a massively important one that people want to orientate themselves around. And so the idea of asking the question, what do I want? And then using something of saying, okay, I've got an answer. This is what I want. And using that thing that I've just defined as what I want, not as the thing that I want, but actually as a way of getting feedback, sets up a discovery process, which again, I think would be more attractive to a lot of our clients. The idea that planning is a creative discovering process probably leans more into an architectural way of thinking, but it's also much more valuable because it opens up the possibility of things that you didn't know that you wanted.
Yeah, and I love it. It's a much more emergent strategy. When we read the business books and we listen to the podcasts and we watch the YouTube shorts about goal setting, it makes it seem as if you set this target, this flag in the sand in the future, and then you forget everything else and you go for that with single-minded focus.
Mm-hmm.
However, it's typically not like that. Typically, achieving something in the future is going to be a squiggly line about going down a lot of dead-end paths and discovering what you actually like. And there's a lot of mistakes that people make when they set goals. And one of the top mistakes is they start out with the vision of what they want. Say, okay, this is what I want. That's typically where most people start with goals, which is what do I want? And we started out talking about that here. The problem with that is it has no sense or context if you don't start out with where you're actually at right now.
Mm-hmm.
So step number one is identify where you at. Before you even figure out what you want as a firm owner, figure out where am I at? And we use something called the Core 4, which is the Core 4 matrix, to help you understand and identify in what areas of life you can start to identify where you're at. So we call it your body, which would be your physical health, your being, your sense of inner confidence, your connection to a higher source or to yourself, your balance, which would be your relationships with other people, and your business, which is all the financial aspects. And if you look at those 4 areas, then you simply begin to talk about what's working in each one of these areas and what's not working. So this is the process that we take ourselves through, that we take clients through every single year, every single month. We review it. We look at these core 4 areas. We take an inventory, what's working, what's not working. And as you begin to look at what's working and what's not working in these areas, you begin to be illuminated about certain of these areas. You realize that you want to improve in those areas. So for instance, in my body quadrant probably the past 2 years, I've wanted to get eye surgery because I'm nearsighted. So I wanted to do away with wearing contacts. And all last year I didn't do it. Just there's something about taking a knife to my body or any sort of surgery that is very...
Taking a knife to your eye.
Yeah, taking a knife to my eye. It's very, makes me kind of nervous. And so I procrastinated, pushed it off. But eventually, because it stayed on what we call my fact map, which is my tool that I use to set my targets and my goals. A couple of weeks ago, I did go in. I was amazed, Ryan. LASIK is incredible. It was literally probably a 25-second procedure, just 25 seconds. The surgeon did it, boom, literally went home, rested for the afternoon. The next day, my vision was already almost 20/20. Amazing,
Wow.
Right? But the whole way that I generated this was I went through a couple years ago, I went through what's working, what's not working. And on my list was what's not working. And we have the different categories. So when we look at what's working, what's not working, for instance, in the body, we can say, okay, how about the function of my internal organs? How about my digestion? How about my cardio fitness? How about my musculature, how I look in my body? How about my body fat percentage? How about my cardiovascular fitness? So these are all measures that we begin to look at. And then once you get that detailed and that granular, it's going to be very easy to set up, okay, here's a couple things that I want to work on this year. And what identified for me is I hated taking my glasses on and off. I hated having to get up in the morning and not really being able to see that well. And now I can't tell you how radically it's impacted my life to be able to wake up in the morning and I can see the clock on the wall. Or I can go get some breakfast and I can see. And the way they did it for me actually was I have what they call monovision, which I've kind of heard of this before, but they didn't touch my left eye. They just did my right eye. So they did my right eye for distance and my left eye for nearsighted, well, for up close, which would be farsightedness for up close. And it's really cool because my dominant eye, which is my right eye, adjusts so that literally I can see in both directions. It's incredible.
Wow.
Yeah, it's totally amazing. And this never would have happened if I wouldn't have gone through that process of what's working, what's not working, right? In addition, I'm going to have a surgery on my legs because I have some mean varicose veins on my right leg. That's a surgery I've been putting off because they got to take me into the emergency, the surgery room, put me under, and then pull some veins out of my legs, which doesn't sound too fun. But if I hadn't have set up the targets, if I hadn't identified what's working, what's not working, it probably never would have happened.
And what is it for you as well, actually writing this down that makes it, because you knew that your eyesight was failing, but there wasn't enough leverage around it. And then something happens when you kind of start to record it, or perhaps you start to record your own, I use the word negligence on it. Like you said you wanted to do this thing, but then 9 months have gone past and nothing has happened. That's quite a reflection. And
yeah, I would say 2 years. I mean, 2 years went past and nothing had happened. Yeah, writing it down, it's essential. This is, any business book, any training, any high-performing individual is going to tell you that writing down your goals is so, so essential. And just doing that alone can have a massive impact. Because when it was on my list and I see that thing on my list, then I'm confronted and I have to ask myself, do I really care about this thing enough to actually change it?
Yeah. And I think it's interesting the way that we do it as well. I had similar sort of experience with my lower back problems and the finally getting on and doing the functional patterns was there was all these other physical goals that I wanted to accomplish, and pain would get in the way of doing it, and it was a problem. And it was the process of writing it down and then, kind of looking at the fact I can't run. And I think I wrote it down at some point on one of the fat map processes that we go through. And it really shook me. I was like, I can't run. Like I knew I couldn't run, but it wasn't something that I'd really sat with the impact of it and how constraining. And that was quite a realization of like, I have to do that's insane. Because if I've not done anything about it for the last 6 months, a year, and this little map of, tracking where I'm at has shown that, then this idea of the default future of not being able to run, having children, not being able to run around with the kids, that was really like, okay, something needs to change, something needs to shift. So it's a good way of getting leverage on ourselves, this exercise of really clarifying where am I at and being really clear and objective with it. So if you're overweight, sometimes a photograph of your belly sticking over your trousers is a really good, there's the reality of it. That's what it looks like. Have a look at it and then put some numbers to it. We tend to avoid that self-reflection because the numbers, we don't want to have to deal with it. But actually, it's a crucial part of being able to get leverage and define what it is that you actually want to have.
Yeah. So there's first of all, identifying what's working, what's not working. There's actually writing it down. There is then do we get to the point of where would I like to be in X number of days, months, years, etc. And so typically we'll set a 12-month target.
Yeah. With the, let's call it the establishing where you're at, we can look at, identifying what the pains and the problems are, like verbalizing them. Here's what's not working as well as I'd like it to. Bringing some sort of measurable, quantifiable reality to it, a number. How long has it been like this? How much do you weigh? What's the magnitude of it in some description? Money, time, etc. And then we can start exaggerating it, if you like, or not. That's not the right word because it's not an exaggeration. We can start recognizing the wider impact of that problem. So, with you and your eyes, you start to realize, this is impacting every part of my life. I'm waking up in the morning, not being able to see the clock, and that sets the rest of my day up of being blurred, or the frustration that it's causing how many times throughout the day. Or I was starting to visualize not being able to run having children in 5, 10, 15 years, whatever. That was scary. So we start to see the impact in other areas of life, or the impact in the future, which really starts to bring home the significance of the situation. And then, of course, the emotional world. Like, we can actually take some stock of, how is this making you feel? And we run this process through with our clients. They're looking at the impacts. They can be quite heavy sessions. There's a bit like it's an, Architects Anonymous type of group, people making their confessions. I've been running my business like this for so many years. Profit hasn't been a priority. And here's the impact. The impact is I haven't been able to pay myself consistently. We've been on the verge of missing payroll. There's nothing planned for my pension. I don't know how I'm going to end the business. And how do I feel about that? Ashamed, resentful, angry, upset. And just having a vocabulary for the feelings also, again, really powerful in terms of reflecting. That's where I'm at. And that's my emotional world that's being created as a result of all this stuff. And now you've just laid that out. Now you're hypersensitive to it, which then again brings up more energy to be able to make a change. And it's like kind of pulling back a catapult. So now you're ready to kind of take aim and start defining what a goal might be.
If we're not making progress on our goals, there's always an emotional reason why we're not doing it.
Yeah.
It's always going to go back to emotion, because ultimately we're emotional creatures. Another mistake that we see people making is they make vague goals. So the goals aren't measurable. This is simple. In any goal setting exercise, it needs to be very, very measurable. So someone might set the goal, I want to lose weight this year, or I want to make more money, or I want to have less stress. And while that's a desire, perhaps, it's not what we would call a goal that we would use in this context of setting. And I don't even like the word goals. I prefer target. I prefer talking about, because goals are so overused. It's almost as if we have a permission slip not to achieve them. Like, a goal, well, that's obviously something that it's a goal. It's something I'm never going to reach. It's just a goal. Whereas a target, no, my target this year is X, Y, or Z. My target this year is to lose 30 pounds, put on 10 pounds of muscle, lose 20 pounds of fat. Very specific. And so as you're setting your goals, look to see, are you making it measurable? If you get to December 31st of this year, will you be able to say with binary confidence, yes, I achieved that, or no, I did not achieve that? And not being wishy-washy on that, because oftentimes, again, when we're reviewing goals, it's too easy to say, well, I kind of did that, or I did great progress. That's all great. We definitely want to be in a positive mindset of, yes, you did great, you did wonderful, and you didn't achieve the target.
Yeah.
And it's just simple as that.
And again, kind of going back to how we were beginning this conversation with, that having a clearly defined target is the mechanism through which you can get feedback. So not having a clearly defined target means that you're not able to get feedback on how you should be growing, how to be getting out of the pains that you've just defined. I can't remember where it was. I was watching something. It might have been a Jordan Peterson thing on the Bible. And interestingly, the word sin, as I remember, actually means, it comes from Greek, and that it means to miss the target. Like that's kind of like more of the original translation of the word sin, is to miss a target, or it has its roots or etymology in an archery term of missing the target. And I thought this is exactly what we're talking about. Because in terms of missing a target, or you not knowing that you're missing a target, that's tends to what happens. And we talk a lot about that when you're living or running your organization without goals, without a future, without any declaration of where it is that you're going, this is when it becomes a very easy environment to do things that aren't working. It's an easy environment for complaint to arise. It's an easy environment for people to feel demotivated, unfocused, for people to become lazy. And then when people kind of get into that kind of routine, then that's when it's very easy for us to be living out of alignment with our own values. So, and as soon as we're living out of our alignment with our own values, because we're not in any way directed or purposeful, that starts to have an impact on our own self-esteem. And then when we're feeling low self-esteem, we don't feel good. So what do? We do something to try and make ourselves feel better. And often
Eat some ice cream.
Procrastinate, watch something.
Do something more destructive.
Exactly. Whatever vice you want to choose, that we become more vulnerable to that kind of behavior because we haven't identified something to be aiming for.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up sin, that deep, dark work of sin. So instead of making this some sort of religious preaching context, you did bring up, I did think of something as you mentioned that, because this word sin, it seems to possibly be related to sinestre, which means left, right? And what's interesting about that concept of the left-hand side or the left-hand path in mysticism, in mythologies, in archetypes, you're typically dividing up the world into two binary opposites. So for instance, in Taoism, we have the yin and the yang, right? We have these two opposing forces. And typically in mystical literature, the left-hand path is a circuitous path. It's based upon cyclical progress as opposed to a linear path, which is just A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You're just hitting the target directly. And oftentimes, I know that in the past, I've thought that setting and achieving goals is all about that direct linear path. Look, if I want to make more money, if I want to have more freedom, if I want to be more creatively fulfilled, if I want to be more switched on with my family, I just need to follow these 4 steps. I'll get the latest business book and it's like A, B, C, D, and I'll just do these things. And then that's the way it works. Unfortunately, I found that applies to some things, but other things it doesn't apply. And so this idea of the left-hand path or this so-called sin, it's more of a cyclical discovering, which goes back to your same comment you said about actually moving ahead and trying something gives us feedback that allows us to then narrow in on the target we want to get. So we see cycles in nature all the time. We see seasons. We go through summer, we go through fall, we go through winter, spring, back to summer again. We see the way that trees, they grow, they blossom, and then in the wintertime, they drop all their leaves. And so there's this natural regenesis of the way that nature equalizes itself. It equilibrizes, I don't even know if that's a word, but it basically creates this homeostasis, not through constancy, not through always being the same thing. But, for instance, in where I live in Central California, we have some fruit trees. And as I was planting fruit trees, I learned that different trees, they need certain numbers of hours in which the temperature is below freezing. So they need that time to be able to get the nutrients back down into the roots so that when the spring comes, they can burst forth and produce fruit. So this is important in business as well. As a matter of fact, this morning I told you that I woke up at 6:30 this morning, did my workout, did some meditation, and I was just feeling exhausted and tired for some reason. Maybe it's jet lag because we're here in New York. And so I went back to bed and I slept. So this idea of giving ourselves permission to sleep, giving ourselves permission to rest. Like business success is not, I don't care what David Goggins says. David Goggins says, push through everything. I just heard a buddy of mine was telling, he just ran a 150 mile race nonstop. And I think about the 75-mile mark, they were afraid his body was failing. He was gonna collapse, and he just kept on going. Now that's great for David Goggins, but what I know is most human beings were not wired like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to be cautious of that kind of advice, that business success is just about working harder.
It's the force, isn't it? It's the power versus force kind of concept that we've spoken about before, where force is, manipulation, coercion, energy, and just like effort based.
I'm just going to push through.
Yeah,
if I just work hard enough.
Just going to grind. And there's something very logical as well. Like when we talk about a linear goal of here are the steps, here's my plan, we're very uncomfortable with a more organic, emergent strategy. We get uncomfortable when we're not forcing or putting effort in, because immediately we're so polarized in our thinking that we immediately assume that we're being lazy or we're not doing anything, which is not what we're talking about. We're kind of thinking about more of a middle, non-dualistic way of allowing goals and targets to emerge through the process of setting a goal and a target. And it kind of comes back to this Buckminster Fuller quote that I saw the other day that was, I thought, very profound. And it is, how often I found where I should be going only by setting out for somewhere else.
That's so beautiful. And we were talking about this yesterday when we were sitting in Washington Park.
Yeah.
And we were both talking about how we went to architecture school. Well, we were passing by, what was it? Were we passing by? We passed by Cooper Union. Yeah, we're admiring the buildings and we're looking into Cooper Union. We're seeing the students in there in the library and we're just having flashbacks. I mean, it took me right back to architecture school, It's just like, even the clothes they're wearing haven't changed.
Yeah, and the white card models in the window.
Yes.
And like they were looking through their Frank Gehry books or probably Morphosis books they were looking at.
Probably. Something.
Yeah.
And you made the comment about how much energy you had put into pursuing an architectural career. And I did the same thing at Cornell University, which is upstate New York. I mean, all the energy, the late nights, the effort I put into learning design, getting a degree, just, honing that aspect of my life, only to discover later that it was not a fit for me. And you discovered the same thing. You ended up going to what? Grimshaw, our Rogers, right, partners. And as we were talking about that, I don't know if I expressed this, but it's easy to feel a bit of regret about that. It's like, oh, why did I waste all that time going to architecture school and pursuing that path when it wasn't a fit for me? Because at the time, me personally, I wasn't too in tune with what I actually wanted. Mm-hmm. I was much more in tune. I knew that I loved art. That's why I went to architecture school, because I loved art. I loved drawing, and I wanted to make a living. I thought that you had to be like a poor artist if you liked art. So, let's just do architecture then, because it seems to be a happy medium. It seems like a way that I could use my creative skills.
Yeah.
And so that was the basic decision that I used to go to architecture school. And what I didn't realize, and I realized this several years coming out of school, is that there's so many different ways that you can have a creative fulfillment in what you do. It's not just something like architecture where you're literally drawing something with your hands. Mm-hmm. As silly as it may sound, I used to work for Subway doing sandwiches, and they call it, back in the day when I did, they call us sandwich artists, right? And as funny as that sounds, there was an element of satisfaction when I would put together a nice sandwich, either for myself or one of my patrons.
I can understand that as well, actually.
Yeah, it's just, it's the joy of creation. Mm-hmm. And I remember this insight I had one day as I'd really gotten to the idea of business, and I began to understand, look at architecture through the lens of business and not just the lens of creativity. And for me, the creative joy in architecture was seeing something created. But one of the things that began to be frustrating for me was how long it took to get an outcome. We would work on projects for a year, 2 years, 3 years. If you're at a larger firm, you could be working on a 10-year project. Literally, you could never, ever see that project actually brought to completion. Now, there's small wins. You could be working on small drawings or details. So you do have those sort of small wins that I would experience in architecture of finishing some cool waterproofing detail or something like that, right? And yet I remember as I was starting to understand this idea of business, I began to see that actually in other professions and other businesses, that creative payback was a lot quicker.
Yeah.
So for instance, back in the day when I was starting to get into understanding architecture through the lens of business, I was intrigued by web design. And whereas a web design project could be pulled off in a month, soup to nuts, beginning to end, commencement to completion, what I found was like for architecture, it would be 2 years. And so it was interesting because I start to see that I experienced a payoff when the project was done. There's this huge rush I found in architecture when a project was completed, when the groundbreaking's happening, when you see it completed, there's like this, or even when you give the drawings to the clients, it's like this, this thing is done. And yet sometimes it would be months and months before I would get that little high, that little dopamine hit myself. And so through that process, I began to discover that, I much prefer, this is why I like business so much. It's because in my experience with the business side of things, it's much easier to get a rapid sort of sense of contentment with having created something.
Yeah.
And that's just the way Enoch is wired. Not saying it needs to work for other people, not saying, the world would be a very boring place if everyone is exactly like Enoch.
But it's interesting because, kind of looking at the time that was invested in a pathway that wasn't a fit, but it was the perfect process to discover that it wasn't a fit.
That is, yes, which is where we're going with this idea in that Buckminster Fuller quote.
Exactly. Is that we only get to find out where you're supposed to be by setting out somewhere else.
Yes, and here's the big danger of not setting goals. Because if you're not setting goals, you may be missing out on the ability to understand what you actually want. And there's a huge cost to that because you could get to the end of your life and find out that, as it says in The Alchemist, your inner dream, your inner vision, your mystical quest hasn't been completed. And that'd be a disappointing place to be at. Goal setting can help us identify that and accelerate that and hone in on what that thing is.
Absolutely. I think that should open up a lot of possibility for people, and certainly with the people that we work with and our clients, is having the ability or the assertiveness to just try something. Like, we talk about decision making, and we can quickly fall into this trap of over analyzing something before we execute on it or take a step forward. And really in business, there's a speed to which decisions need to be made. And the reason why is not necessarily because it's the right decision, but if you make a decision and move forward, you can find out more quickly whether it was the right decision, and then you can iterate on it and change tact. Whereas if we don't do anything, then we spin our wheels.
Yeah, and this is something that I personally am not good at. And I have a feeling maybe some of our listeners struggle with this as well, which is analysis paralysis. In other words, trying to be so detail-oriented or so prescriptive about what we want to do and being so overwhelmed by the many options available to us to get there that we end up not doing anything. And I've had a number of mentors and coaches. One of them gave me this beautiful example of when we go to the grocery store, we don't sit in our parking lot and wait for all of the green lights to simultaneously turn green at the same time so we can drive unimpeded to our destination. Or another example he would give is, if you're in the middle of the ocean and you're afraid of drowning and, you don't just sit there. You start swimming in some direction. Oh, I think Johan was telling me, he said, the key indicator of success for a business person or an entrepreneur, and I would say for anyone in life, is speed of execution, decisiveness and speed of execution. Not doing the right thing, but doing something Because when you do something, like you said, it gives you the feedback to know what doesn't work. You can triangulate and you move forward in this cyclical nature. Again, as we talk about that idea of left versus right, linear versus cyclical, it's more of a moving process to identify as we're discovering what do we truly like, what works, what doesn't work. And when we can drop into that, life becomes fun, business becomes dynamic, but it does rely on some of these harder, more concrete business skills like planning and traditional goal setting.
Absolutely.
And that's a wrap. And here's today's Smart Practice Tooltip. Every great practice runs on great people, but finding them, well, that's the hard part, isn't it? Which is why we created the Rockstar Hiring Guide. This guide gives you the exact tools we use inside the Smart Practice operating system to attract top-tier talent, even if you think your firm's too small or the market's too tough. This isn't theory. It's a plug-and-play system built to help you find your perfect team member. You can grab your free copy by going to businessofarchitecture.com/rockstar. And now a word from today's sponsor.
Today's episode is sponsored by Gelt. Is your architecture firm just filing taxes or actually using them to grow the business? Gelt is your partner in optimizing your taxes so you can focus on scale. They work with you year-round, not just at tax time, taking a proactive approach that combines expert CPAs and powerful technology, from smart entity structures to overlooked deductions and smarter compensation planning. Gelt helps architecture firms unlock strategies most accountants miss. And exclusively for Business of Architecture listeners, Gelt is offering 10% off your first year. Don't wait for next tax season. Schedule your complimentary consultation at joingelt.com. That's JOINGELT.com to learn more and mention BOA when you sign up.
Also, thank you to our recent listeners who left reviews for us on podcast on iTunes. Your reviews help others find this podcast, so this rising tide raises all boats. A special thanks to Alan P., Susan Scarlett McCaw. To be acknowledged on the show, open up the podcast app on your iPhone, search for Business of Architecture, and after clicking on the show, scroll all the way to the bottom to leave us a review. Today's episode of the Business of Architecture show is sponsored by Smart Practice, the world's leading step-by-step solution for architectural practice owners that want to structure their existing practice so the complexity of business doesn't get in the way of the architecture. Because here's the truth, free advice can get you started, but if you want real transformation and real results, you need advice that's tailored to your exact situation. That's exactly what we help clients with here at Business of Architecture, and that's why they get the incredible results that you hear about here on the podcast. So if you're ready to quit being a glorified administrator and get back to architecture again, go to smartpracticemethod.com and get instant access to a video that shows you the proven, simple, and easy to implement Smart Practice method that can literally revolutionize the way that you run your firm and help you get more of what we call the 3 Fs: freedom, financial reward, and exceptional fulfillment. As always, I want to thank you for joining me today and remind you that the views expressed on this show by our guest do not represent those of the hosts, and we make no representation, promise, guarantee, pledge, warranty, contract, bond, or commitment except to help you have more fun with less stress. Carpe diem.